People are spontaneously quiet themselves, so we might take that as good. Really great turnout for a wintry out of semester day, so thanks everyone for coming along. It's my pleasure to introduce and to host Dr. Poppy Watson. She's going to be talking in the roundtable today. So Poppy is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Technology, Sydney, and an ARC Future Fellow. Her research examines how environmental cues influence attention and choice behaviour, with a particular focus on the tension between explicit goals and more reflexive responses shaped by reward learning and habit. So she uses behavioural experiments alongside methods such as eye tracking and neuroimaging, investigating the mechanisms that contribute to unwanted patterns of behaviour in both healthy and clinical populations. Poppy is originally from New Zealand and completed her Master of Research and her PhD at the Uni of Amsterdam, which I didn't realise. She worked at UNSW Sydney from 2017 to 2023, recently crowned as the #1 university in Australia, I believe. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. But since 2023, Poppy has been based at UTS Sydney, where she's helped develop the undergraduate psychology program alongside her research as a Future Fellow. And just personally, I'm really delighted to host Poppy as well, because I know Poppy a little bit personally and have always taken her research as a really great exemplar of someone whose program spans the basic science and the applied stuff in a way that does justice to the complexity of both. So really excited to hear what you have to talk about today.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan, for that lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be down here and to be able to have a whole day of talking about research. Really special. So yeah, what I'm going to be talking to you guys today is about associative mechanisms underlying behaviour, and really I focus on these cues that are around us in the environment that might be driving our behaviour, sometimes in unwanted ways. So when you think about alcohol or tobacco addiction or gambling or many sorts of unwanted behaviours, these cues in the environment or the context, the people that might trigger our behaviours are often argued to be key factors that might promote relapse, that might lead to problematic behaviours that are kind of unwanted but from an explicit goal-directed perspective. And I did my PhD in an associative learning lab, so I've really always been from this tradition. And what I was planning to talk to you guys today is about both habits, so this idea that through this behavioural repetition we can have this stimuli and context that might trigger behaviours in a very kind of reflexive, automatic way through these stimulus-response associations. And I also do quite a lot of stuff looking at more Pavlovian learning and how learning about how cues signal reward, how that can then trigger all types of behaviours and influence and ongoing instrumental behaviour. I've realised in making this talk that I don't really have time to talk about that, so I'm just going to focus today on the habit stuff, but I'm happy to talk about any Pavlovian instrumental transfer or anything, because that is I still do a lot of stuff there. But I wanted to tell you guys the story about the work that's been going on for quite a few years now about habits and habit learning in our field. So yeah, habits are obviously, we use the word a lot in our everyday usage about how habits might have good habits or bad habits, and they're often linked to good healthy habits that might be linked to exercise and eating well, unhealthy habits that might be too much doom scrolling, too much drinking unhealthy sodas. So habits are a big part of what we kind of use it a lot to describe our behaviour. And in an associative learning framework, habits have been contrasted with goal-directed control for a very long time. And the thing I like about the associative learning framework is that a habit is very clearly defined. And when we talk about goal-directed actions, we're talking about things that are controlled by the consequences. So here's a little schematic which can kind of show that in a goal-directed system, the idea is that the response will only ever follow the outcome after the outcome has been assessed for whether or not the outcome is currently desired. Where, we know the consequences of our actions and we currently desire the outcome, and therefore we will make the response. Now, there's different debates within associative learning as to whether the response should come before the outcome in this model. I'm not too worried about that. It's more just to show you that responses are driven in this, by anticipation of the outcome. On the other hand, the habit system, these are stimulus bound, these are reflexes, slips of action. So where the stimulus is now directly triggering the behavior without any anticipation or thought about or evaluation of the outcome. And when we look at people's behavior, you might go to the movies and you might When you go and line up for popcorn, are you doing that because you really do want to eat the popcorn right now, or are you just doing it because that's what you always do when you go to the movies? So that idea that the context can really drive this type of behavior in a very mindless way, where you're not really evaluating the popcorn outcome. And a classic one is driving or cycling a route that you always go, and then you're planning to stop halfway and do something, maybe pull into a shop, pick up your dry cleaning. And when you set off, you have this intention in your mind that that's what you're going to do, but then you can get to a specific section where you always turn left, and you'll just make that response, and then realize, oh, meant to be doing something else. So this kind of very strong stimulus response, context response association that might override what you're intending to actually do, your goal-directed control. And the kind of dominant paradigm that we use for looking at goal-directed versus habit to kind of see whether a behaviour meets the criteria for being goal-directed or habitual comes from work that was done at Cambridge in the 1980s and this is a very classic paper where animals were trained to, in the specific, when a lever came out, they were trained to push the lever and earn a food reward. And this happens many, many times, right? So the animal learns that this lever is signaling that a response will lead to the outcome. And then to see whether or not the behavior, whether the behavior is habitual or goal-directed, we first have an outcome evaluation phase where typically the rat might be fed a lot of these food pellets to make them less desirable. They're often paired with illness so that they really become very aversive. And then we just put the rat back into the Skinner box to see what happens when the stimulus now appears. And the classic study from Adams showed that when there was only moderate training, that the animals were pushing more often for the valuable compared to animals that had where the food had been devalued. This idea that the animals that have experienced the devaluation, they didn't desire the food outcome, right? So they're pushing less frequently. There is still some residual responding there, but they're able to inhibit their response because they don't want the outcome. They know that the lever press typically has led to this food palette, which is no longer desirable. So they're acting in a goal-directed manner. On the other hand, rats that had extensive training didn't show this differentiation, right? So there was just this continued responding on the lever when it appeared, even though the outcome was no longer desirable. So this has kind of been, the outcome evaluation test has been used for many, many years in both humans and animals. And the way we do it in humans is typically like some sort of instrumental training phase where people are learning that stimuli signal whether a right or a left key press leads to one of two outcomes, might be popcorn and chocolate. And then we can either feed people on one of those food rewards to evaluate, or we might even instruct them to say, popcorn is now devalued. Every time you make a response for a popcorn outcome, you're going to lose money. So we give them some sort of points that they'll then lose if they keep responding for the devalued. And then we just see what happens when we present the stimuli. Are they able to inhibit that responding for the devalued outcome, acting in a goal-directed way, or do they seem to just kind of always make the response that they learned during training in more of a habitual manner? And we look at the figure and we say, okay, we compare the responses or the accuracy on these two trial types. And if it's not goal-directed, then it must be habit. So I don't want you guys to have to worry about this big table, but it's just to show you that the neurobiology has been so well characterized over the years. And there's very similar brain regions involved in goal-directed control versus SR habit in both animals and humans. So showing that if you can really keep behavior, you can stop behavior transitioning to habitual if you just, if there's not intact infralimbic cortices, for example. And same thing, animals can never transition to habitual or never be goal-directed in the first place with these different manipulations. And we've seen similar things in humans. And the link to psychopathology is also very well established. So in animals, this idea that methamphetamine, rats that have had exposure to methamphetamine, and then when they're put into a classic outcome evaluation setup, they're more likely to transition faster to habits than rats who are naive. And in humans, there's been a ton of work showing that poorer performance on these outcome evaluation tasks, so the tendency to respond for devalued outcomes, is linked to things like OCD, linked to all sorts of addictions and even anorexia, for example. So there's this huge body of work, which is, I'm painting you this picture that this is this fantastic thing, but there's a bit of a kicker, which I'm sure some people already noticed. So the problem is that SR habits are really hard to research, surprisingly. This might come as a surprise because it's something that has been so well researched over the years, but during my PhD and then subsequently working in the habit lab, really kind of thinking about some of these issues that are kind of naturally arising. So one of the main problems is that the outcome evaluation test really measures goal-directed control, right? And habits are inferred from this null result. So we just say, well, if someone's not being goal-directed, then it shows they've got stronger habits than someone else. But, we can't infer here that there's meaningful, we can't find evidence for a positive SR association when it's just a null effect. So that's been a big issue that's been discussed a lot in the field. The other issue is that humans really perform very well in the outcome evaluation test. So, especially healthy individuals. And I realized this when I was starting to do a lot of neuroimaging work, trying to do the outcome evaluation task in the scanner, and realizing that if you just want to look at trials where people make a slip of action, there's actually very few. So people are actually really good when they come to the lab and they're, trying to be a good participant. They're actually really good at responding for valuable, not responding for devalued. So there's this kind of discrepancy between the way that we all know that we've experienced that kind of habitual slip of action where we've just accidentally been triggered by a kind of familiar context to do something without really thinking about it. But there's this kind of discrepancy between trying to study this in the lab in a meaningful way. So why are habits so hard to measure? And I'm sure for some of you, many of you think, well, probably there's not enough training, right? So animals are trained often across many days in the lab, and often we do these habit studies like a 1-hour session where people learn very quickly the associations, and then we do some devaluation, and then we test whether or not they can flexibly change their behavior. The jury's really out on how long it actually takes to form a habit. And that's something that we've been looking at for quite a few years now, trying to kind of find the sweet spot where we can see evidence for SR associations that are very, that have just emerged versus SR associations that are really ingrained and can really trigger these behaviors in the way that we would expect theoretically. So I'm going to talk you guys through a task that we've been using the last few years to try and get at this question of how can we study SR habits in a way that doesn't rely on a null result and can show sensitivity to training effects. So this is called the symmetrical outcome evaluation task. And under this, it involves 4 ice creams, right? And participants get to see at the beginning of every block which 2 ice creams are valuable and which are not. So up here in this green thing, they can see that the top 2 are worth they're worth points on this upcoming block, and the other 2 are not valuable. And participants are earning money from this task. So every time they get a successful, valuable outcome, they get a point, and every time they respond for a devalue, they lose a point, and the points turn into money at the end. So people tend to be fairly motivated to try and learn this. And they're playing the role of this little skateboarder. A stimulus will appear. We've got 8 different coloured vans. It will appear. It signals which of the ice creams is going to be appearing. The participant has to decide before the ice cream appears at the halfway point whether or not they're going to push or respond to try and collect the valuable ice cream, or if they know, if they've learned that this is a not valuable ice cream, then they should just not respond and let the van go past. But here, the participant was able to successfully capture the valuable ice cream, and they earned a point. And the way we set it up is that there's 8 different stimuli with these 4 ice creams. And we do it in 2 different blocks. So participants are just exposed to the top 4 stimuli in the first block, and the top 2 ice creams are valuable and the bottom 2 are devalued. Whereas on the second set of blocks, it's the same 4 ice creams, but now the value has switched. And this is why it's symmetrical, because during training, every outcome is associated with sometimes valuable, sometimes not valuable. And we also included a manipulation here where people saw some stimuli more than others to try and see whether if this overtraining effect, we could see it in this task and within subjects' ways. So if participants had lots more of these learning that the yellow one predicted a valuable magnum and that they should respond, whether that would differ from the response to a short trained association. So people learn this in these two separate blocks. So at the beginning, they're told which two ice creams they're responding for, and they learn this. It takes a while. There's 8 different stimuli, but humans are very clever and they can learn this pretty quick, especially our psychology students. They learn this pretty quick. And then we have a test phase. Test phase is exactly the same. They're told at the beginning which 2 ice creams you should be collecting. And now the only thing is there's no feedback, so they just get this generic ice cream banner. They're not still learning any associations during the test phase. So they're just they're told that they're still collecting points, but they are not given any feedback on whether or not they've correctly received the right ice cream. And how we get around changing the value is that now we present all 8 stimuli intermixed in the test phase. So for the participants, nothing's changed in terms of the instructions. They're still, meant to be responding for the valuable and not responding for the devalued. But now we have these incongruent stimuli from the other block that were consistently trained during training to not be valuable, so they shouldn't respond. And we see that we have these inconsistent stimuli. So participants do this training phase, and the conditions that we're really interested in is conditions when they don't have to respond, so that they should not be responding for this ice cream during the test phase because it's not valuable. And then we just have these stimuli that differ in terms of their learning history, right? So we have the vans that were not valuable during training. They signaled a not valuable ice cream on every block during training, and they're still signaling a not valuable ice cream. So we call these the still not valuable trials, right? And what we're interested in is the devalued trials. So participants, every time they saw those 2 vans, they knew that the ice cream was valuable. They were pushing the space bar, and then suddenly now it's not valued, right? So they need to inhibit that learn response. And that's where we see this competition between the goal-directed, I should not be pushing here because this is not valuable ice cream, versus the devalued, the learning history where they should always respond. So this conflict between the SR and the OR associations. And just to really hammer that home, in this example, we have the stimulus that's been always go versus no go. And then at test phase, suddenly that switches. For the purple one's exactly the same, but now the brown one has this conflict. So what we want to do is just compare accuracy on these 2 trial types where we know that the response requirements during the task are the same. All that's different is the learning history and this conflict between the SR association that's built up during the training. And the nice thing about it is that then we've got this, by comparing these 2, we can see that if participants are really good on the still not valuable trials, but much less accurate on the habit system, then we think that this is really evidence that this SR association is interfering with behaviour at tests. So it's not relying on the null effect, and we now can't really say that much about the goal-directed system because again, this is now it's just the null effect. It's just not evidence of habit. So we've been using this task for quite a bit, and as I said during that complicated table, and I'm really sorry about that, but I am going to be talking about this task for a couple of studies, so I thought best to kind of talk you through it carefully. In this particular study, we had this some stimuli were seen more than others, right? I'm not sure whether we are sharing this stuff. Some stimuli were seen more than others. So we had 2 studies. In the first one, they saw the short trained stimuli 32 times. So they appeared, so some of those vans that were the short trained appeared 32 times during training. And some of them appeared 96 times. So they saw some with much more frequency than others. And what you can see here is if we look at accuracy, you can see that we do see this effect of the devaluation. So people are not as good on the devalued trials relative to the still not valuable. So even though the test requirements are the same, we are seeing evidence here of this kind of difficulty with overcoming that learned SR association. Sorry, I'm not sure why it's doing this. But we don't see any difference between the long and the short trainings. The difference between the black and the grey bars was really where we were hoping to see the stronger SR associations would emerge with this extended training like we've seen in the animals. Is this a cable thing or a?
Could be a cable thing.
Okay. So what we did in the second experiment was we got people to train at home. So they came to the lab, they practiced the task, then we installed it on their laptop, they went away, they trained every day for about half an hour and had to send us like the logs of their training and stuff. And so they saw the short train stimuli 74 times and the long train stimuli 518 times. But as you can see, we still don't see any effect of overtraining on these associations. So we're still seeing this kind of interference from the habit system, but it's not sensitive to the amount of training. And this has been replicated many times now. So this is just taken from a paper where they've tried 5 different experiments using sometimes aversive outcomes, sometimes food, sometimes the points like we've been using, and doing within subjects, between subjects, all different sorts of training schedules. And yeah, we just don't really see any evidence. So this is an example from a within subjects experiment, very similar to ours, where you do see an effect of devaluation, but you don't see any difference between the 1 and 3 day trained stimuli. And this is a between subjects, again, where there's just no difference of this effect of training length, which is kind of problematic for our associative models, right? This idea that behavior repetition leads to these stronger SR links, which should emerge and really start to interfere with goal-directed behavior. The fact that we don't really see it, and a lot of people have been looking for a very long time, is a bit of an issue. So I'm just going to talk through some of the kind of ways that we've thought, well, maybe we're not seeing it because participants, you know, they're trying really hard. They come to the lab, they're trying really hard to be focused, be a good participant. And so that's why they, we just don't kind of get these slips of action. We're not really measuring the right thing. And David Luque, who was at UNSW for a while, he had some evidence that this kind of might be what's going on, because he asked participants not just to withhold a response if a stimulus was signaling a devalued outcome, but actually to make an opposite response, so to switch responding. So it was still an outcome evaluation task, in that it wasn't simply, you know, respond for this stimulus, oh, now the mapping's changed, respond to this one. They had to do it on the basis of the outcome value, so they had to assess whether or not the outcome was devalued, and if it was, then they should make a different response. And he found some evidence. So here we're just looking at the likelihood of making the correct switch. And we're just interested, don't worry about the red and blue, we're just interested in comparing day 1 versus day 3 training. And you can see that when they look at the overt responses, like we always look at in our studies, there's no evidence there of any overtraining effects. But when they look at the switched costs, which is the reaction time difference to make the new response, you do see that after 3 days of training, there's more interference there. So people find it, they're slower, they're able to make the other response, but they do it with there's more interference. So this is kind of a good indication that there is something happening there, that the participants are able to kind of override it in a way, and it doesn't affect their overt behavioural responses. So in collaboration with Evan and Dom and an honours student, Jesse, that's not what he looks like, we came up with this idea that maybe we could use TMS, and specifically the corticospinal excitability, to try and measure prepotent tendencies to respond before the participants actually made a response, to try and see whether we can, this is a more sensitive measure of measuring this kind of the degree to which someone is primed and ready when they see a stimulus to make that response, even if it's for a devalued outcome. So I'm sure you all know about TMS, that it, it's often used to try and inhibit brain regions or enhance activation. But you can also measure the excitability of the cortico system by measuring the motor evoked potential that's elicited. So there's a little electrode on the opposite hand, and that can, you can use this to measure the excitability of the system at the time that you probe it. So these guys have been using TMS in this way for quite a while. And this is an example of the type of study they've been doing, which is more of an instructed SR association. So there's no outcomes here, there's no devaluation or anything. It's just simply in the training phase, people are told respond on the space bar every time you see an animal or a banana. So they go through and they do that. Obviously, they're very good at that. And in the test phase, they're told, keep responding for animals, but now don't respond for bananas anymore. And you do the TMS pulse, during bananas, when participants have previously been responding, but now should not be. And they also do it on a control condition, the buttons, where it's never been relevant. It's just a kind of filler stimulus. And what these guys found is that if they deliver a TMS pulse 100 milliseconds before the median reaction time, you see these increased MEPs on bananas relative to the buttons, right? So this idea that on those banana trials, the participant is used to responding all the time. So there's kind of the motor system is really, as soon as it sees the banana, your motor system is primed to respond. And that's what's being measured with this MEP. And actually they were able to trigger erroneous responses for bananas. So participants, if there was a TMS pulse on a banana, they were more likely to make the response compared to when no TMS pulse was delivered. So suggesting that there's this kind of, the TMS was able to just push the response over some sort of threshold and make the participant make an error, which didn't happen on the button trials. So yeah, this seemed like a perfect technique that we could use in our paradigm. So participants during they did the training phase as per usual, and we also did the short, long training like we'd done in our first experiment. And then we just presented in the test phase a TMS pulse for each stimulus, either not at all, or minus 100 milliseconds before the median RT, or 100 milliseconds after. And we're expecting only this condition to actually show us an effect of this kind of prepotent behavior that's there. And so this is what we get when we look at the MEPs. So you can see here that for the early TMS, we do see that relative to the still not valuable trials, the devalued trials, there is a larger MEP there. So the idea is that the participant has been, responding every time they've seen these stimuli. So there is this evidence of this kind of increased corticospinal excitability on these trials when the stimulus appears, which makes perfect sense. But you can see when we look at the red versus blue bars that there's no evidence there of there being a stronger, a larger MEP or more corticospinal excitability if people have been repetitively learning these stimulus response associations. So yeah, not what we were hoping for there. And if we look at the if we look just at the devalued trials, we can see that when there was early TMS, they made slightly more errors. So they're responding more on these devalued trials when there's a TMS pulse compared to when there's not, suggesting that we were also able to kind of push them over some sort of threshold. We also saw that on the still not valuable trials, right? So these, there hasn't been this SR history here. These have always been trials where a stimulus appeared and someone did not respond. So we wouldn't expect there to be this kind of SR, what this is a kind of philosophical question. Can there be an S-no response? Is that an association? How is no response represented? Which I think is a really interesting question, but for our purposes, the point is that there's no stimulus go association here, but we were still able to trigger an erroneous response. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting finding. So yeah, we found that this approach really complemented the behavioural analyses, but there was no effective extended training, which is again just something we keep finding, and it's a real problem for our models. And we also saw this on the still not valuable trials too, where we were able to kind of trigger this erroneous response with the TMS pulse, but that was there even for trials we wouldn't expect it. And I think that we can reconcile this. If you remember the study with the bananas and the buttons, they didn't see that effect on the button trials, which was their control. But I think there are a lot of differences here because our control stimulus, these still not valuable trials, the participant has to pay attention to those. They have to make a decision on every trial, what response they're going to carry out. So they do have some sort of motivational and attentional salience, right? Compared to those buttons that are just fillers coming through in the visual system. So I think that's probably why we were able to push, trigger these erroneous responses. But it's interesting this happened, probably got nothing to do with SR associations, which is interesting, but for our purposes, a bit of a shame. So you might think, okay, it's time to give up, right? SR associations obviously don't get stronger with training. That's just the way they are. Maybe they're just there immediately and that's it. So that has big implications for our models, especially if we want to understand them in the context of behaviors like addiction, and these behaviors where, they're argued to really have this powerful effect on behavior. So we didn't want to give up just yet. We did one final study where we wanted to see, okay, maybe this participants, they're doing this training, they're getting in the zone, and then we say to them, okay, now it's the test phase, so you've got to try really hard, you've still got to respond, and you've still got to respond for the valuable outcomes, and you're going to see all of 8 of them now instead of just 4. So we kind of explain that the context is shifting. So maybe this kind of makes them be like, oh, okay, I need to pay attention again now. I really need to focus and really maximize my earnings in this test phase. So a way to get around this was we thought, okay, why don't we use a working memory load at test to try and kind of stop that goal-directed system really being able to take over. So what we did was they trained as normal, and then at the test phase, they split into 2 groups, some of whom are in the memory load condition and some in the control condition. Memory load condition, at the beginning of each trial, they see 2 numbers that differ in terms of their value and also in terms of their physical size. They have to keep those in memory while they do a trial of the ice creams, collecting the valuable and making sure they don't accidentally click the devalued, not valuable, and then they're prompted to either enter the letter that had, the number that had the highest value or that had the biggest size. So they're prompted here with value or size, and they have to respond left or right. So it's quite hard. In the no memory load condition, they're just told push left, push right, just to control for responding during the test phase. And what we were interested to see was what effect will this working memory load have? Will it kind of show us a stronger emergence of the SR association? So what did we find? We found that indeed the working memory load really did seem to affect performance. So the black bars are the working memory load, and you can see that the trials we're really interested in, where we would expect the working memory load to really lead to errors and show this kind of, allow this SR associations to take more control. We do see that seems to be the case in that condition. We are still seeing an effect here, and they're still not valuable, right? But even after controlling for this kind of overall tendency to make an error on these trials, this is still, a much stronger effect. And interestingly, we don't see any effect on the valuable trials. And I haven't really talked about them because, again, they're a bit weird. How if you have an upvalued trial that during training you never respond, and then now you have to respond, which, that's not kind of based on an SR association, but there is still that incongruent. But as you can see, absolutely no effect there, which I think is really interesting. But we see here that we're able to allow these SR associations to interfere more with behavior when participants are under working memory load. So our next step is really to try and combine this working memory manipulation with the overtraining to see whether that's our last ditch attempt. See, that's something we're going to be starting very soon, to try and see whether we can use this to try and show these sensitivities to overtraining in the SR association. But who knows? Who knows? So just to kind of sum all this up, it's still really unclear how much training we need. And actually that classic Adams study that I introduced at the beginning from the 80s, there's actually been some recent attempts to replicate that, and perhaps it's not as straightforward as it was always assumed to be. So it's a bit of a, yeah, the classic, a whole, you know, field being built upon one dodgy study. Sorry, no, sorry. I don't want to, no, I mean, there is a lot of pushback at the moment, so especially in the human world, there is a lot of pushback about this idea that we've just assumed as a given all this time. We've just assumed that this is, you know, this is our model. This is how SR habits emerge, and they interfere with goal-directed control, and they get very strong with overtraining. So that's, yeah, that's kind of something that we have to consider might not be correct. And I think, yeah, doing that TMS study was fantastic as a way just to kind of probe these questions in a different way. So yeah, I've got some collaborators who are really together. We're trying to work on grant applications at the moment to try and, yeah, really get at this using different methods to try and understand how information is represented when you see a stimulus. What's brought to, you know, as the response, the thing that dominates, or is the outcome? So really trying to look at a more fine-grained way about how these things are represented, which is very fun, and hopefully we will be able to get funding for that. And I think we do need to prevent goal-directed control, right? It's just this thing about bringing humans to the lab. It's very different to having animals in the lab who, you know, just don't have that kind of social desirability, or what am I going to do after work? And it would be great to take home a you know, a $20 voucher to be able to buy food on the way home, and just all those kind of motivations that our students and our human participants have when they come in, which really does affect their behaviour. But I guess that also feeds into the implications, right? Is that if these habits are so easily overridden, if they're so sensitive to context, you know, it really begs the question of how much they can really be used to explain problematic behaviours. You know, behaviours that are so extreme, such as like we see in drug addiction, or, you know, in anorexia. So that's kind of something that the field is definitely grappling with at the moment. So just from a pure theoretical perspective, like I said, you know, we've just been relying on this model, and it's been just a kind of, yeah, an important thing, and for a lot of us in doing research. So it's just a bit of a concern that we don't see this kind of very clear emergence of these SR associations that we can easily probe as being stronger following behavioural repetition. And like Jan de Houwer, who I'm sure a lot of you know, he's really feels very strongly that this is kind of, you know, there's this alternative view that everything's really goal-directed, that all human behaviour, we shouldn't believe that a stimulus can automatically trigger a behaviour. And like Peter Loverbond at UNSW, we often have this discussion where we're driving and he says, "Oh no, Poppy, I was about to turn left because I normally go left there." And he's like, "Oh no, the context just made me want to go left." So I think there are definitely yeah, skeptics out there who think this kind of pursuit of this kind of elusive SR habit is probably unnecessary, right? That we can alternatively explain everything in terms of outcome anticipation, that everything's driven by, our behaviour is always driven by the consequences. And maybe when we think about these problematic behaviours, like we see in addiction or anorexia, we need to think about, yeah, we need to focus more on why are these outcomes so powerful for people? Why is the drive for thinness, or the desire for the drug outcome, why is that so powerful? So looking more at assessing the value of these reinforcers rather than trying to rely on this kind of stimulus response, something that's happening, triggered by cues. And I guess that's a lot of the Pavlovian stuff, is also looking more at how stimuli trigger these outcome expectancies. And I think, yeah, when you think about craving, the outcome has to focus, right? We can't crave something without thinking about the way it makes you feel, or that's kind of part of what the craving is. So I think there's certainly something to be said for these models. And I think the thing is that it can become very moralistic. So if we start saying that people are just overvaluing drugs over and above their children, you know, it does have the risk of becoming a very moral, yeah, there's definitely implications there for the way we think about it. But I think these are really important questions to help us kind of help people and further better understand, yeah, what role can these simple associative mechanisms have in behaviour. So yeah, I hope I didn't put anyone off studying habits. Apologies to anyone who does. I still am, yeah, definitely think that these simple associative mechanisms really can explain a lot of behaviour in humans. But yeah, we have these very strong models and we actually have quite weak experimental data. So bridging that gap is really key and something that, yeah, I'm hoping to be able to contribute to over the next few years. So yeah, thanks so much for listening.
15 minutes or so for questions.
Robin, you're best.
Oh, that was so great, Poppy. So many questions, but I can't help coming back to what you were saying about the people in the lab, because I think all of us recognise when we're doing things that are habitual in the wild.
Yeah.
And we know that happens, like the popcorn is classic.
Yeah.
So we can't deny the existence of those habits.
Agreed. Yeah.
And so just are all, and this, you know, you're all in psychology departments. So is it like this sampling bias where we just have these super studious psychology students they're all really smart, they all really want to get their voucher or whatever. Can you get more, you know, representative people from, you know, the whole population? And also I'm thinking, is there some way of looking at this behaviour in the wild, like using EMA or that kind of thing, and getting more naturalistic habitual behaviour? Obviously very messy, but
yeah,
is that going to be more
That's
revealing?
a great point. And so for the first one, I agree that, yeah, the psychology students, they're just very switched on, focused, used to being, you know, doing studies and are really motivated to do well, particularly when there's financial incentive.
And they might have also been learning about this in their undergraduate lectures.
Yeah. And that's, yeah, I would say that that's often the problem, is that when we do a lot of the studies that we've done in the clinical samples, I think there as well, though, like it's often really hard to recruit healthy controls, who often tend to be, you know, really well-educated older participants who are really keen to do well and be good participants. So I think, yeah, I think it's just kind of a problem with that type of research. And maybe this lab-based work is just not that suitable. So Sanne de Wit and Tim, who's Utrecht and Amsterdam, they have been doing quite a lot of cool stuff about in the wild, trying to look at things like switching key covers. They've got this cool paper where they give people like a coloured key cover to put on their keys, and then they have to go and like use the key cover every day to go in and out of their home and stuff, and then they switch it. But then it's tricky because you're relying on self-report slips of action, but yeah, that's kind of a cool way. And they've got something really cool with social media where they had to install specific apps on people's phones that look like Facebook or Instagram, whatever, and then they can measure every time the participant like clicks on it, touches it. Yeah, so stuff like that. It is coming out. Yeah, so I think that work, and they will always do the slips of action task in the lab, and it often correlates to people's in the wild habits, which is promising, but I guess it's still that kind of, is it SR or is it just failures in goal-directed control, or what the hell is it?
And then can I just do one follow-up? Is obviously all of this is done in healthy controls, but what about in the people with the maladaptive behaviours? Like, would you anticipate the same thing?
Anticipate
what all of the work that you've just presented there in healthy controls, do you feel a burning need to look at people with addiction or
to look at their overtraining effects and things? Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that, you know, I think before we start burdening our clinical population saying please go home and train on this very boring task for 8 days, I think we probably want to see evidence that this is like a first. Right. The idea is that this is a very, you know, conserved property of animals and humans, that we have this, you know, tendency for these associations to emerge. So yeah, I would be a little bit reticent to, but yeah, I would predict exactly the same thing, to be honest.
And then what if you stressed the person?
Yeah, stress is a good one. So Otto Otto, has done stuff looking at stress, and that triggers people to be more habitual. Yeah, so I think stress is a good way, a bit like the working memory manipulation, right? Like you're just trying to cut out that goal-directed control. Yeah, but not with overtraining, so we'll have to see.
Yeah, great talk. I had one more question about the GMS study, about the fact that you were that didn't find transfer to the button, but you found transfer to your still valued or
still not valuable. Yeah.
And do you think there is a difference in the proportion of like go, no go? It feels like maybe they had fewer go.
Yeah, that's
so
a very
the
good
kind
point.
of overall response was kind of less of a tendency to respond, while yours maybe had more go.
Yeah.
And so you passed the threshold sort of more easily.
That is very true. So in our study, again, because it's the symmetrical task, on half the trials they should be responding and half they shouldn't, and that's all the way through, right? It's very balanced responding. Yeah, whereas their one, that they only responded for animals, and so it certainly wasn't half the animals and the bananas. So yeah, I agree that probably
That could be a way of kind of
matching it up. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. But also I think that, yeah, in our task, the stimuli are all, during training, they have to learn about every stimulus and what it signals. There's a lot of like focus and learning going on for all these different stimuli, because you can't just learn which response to make. You have to learn about that stimulus outcome relationship. That's the way the task's been designed. So I think it's, yeah, probably not that surprising that we also saw that we were able to kind of trigger some behavior with the stimulus that was very relevant, but we didn't see it on the you know, the other two trial types, which I think is fascinating. This whole what it means to not go during training. And yeah,
can I jump in because I have a question related to exactly that? Is it theoretically, do you think it's possible to have a no-go habit? Like if I go habit, right? Like I go every time I go to the petrol station, I buy myself a Snickers bar. Every time I go to the petrol station, I don't buy myself a Mars bar. Like, am I learning a no Mars bar habit?
I don't know. I don't think I doubt it. That's a bit broad, but
under what circumstances? Like what do you need to do before you can get an inhibition habit?
Yeah, no, inhibition habits are definitely an interesting, and I know there's been some work like, you know, about that these are represented as no-goes. I guess the question is a no-go response represented as some sort of response? If there's, you know, during a lab-based task when you're learning the stimulus, I should not go. Yeah, how is that represented? Is that learned as a stimulus response association, just that the response is no-go? And there's been some fMRI work by like Kuhn and Brass in Belgium suggesting that it is represented in some way similar to the way the response would be represented. But yeah, we certainly don't see much action on those trials that are now upvalued, where someone has to respond. They find it harder to change, to make the opposite response, but it's hard to know what's driving that.
Do you think that Mike Capelli's been involved in some of this stuff? Do you think people are learning to ignore certain cues?
Yeah, I don't know if they are, because it changes all the time. And I'm not sure. It's a good question. Yeah, whether they're learning to ignore. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic talk. A million questions, though, just last one. I think a lot of the sort of converging lines of the evidence, particularly sort of in the switch RT costs and the sort of TMS pulse and things like that, some of the behavior sounds like it mirrors, not the same as, of course, but something like a Stroop task or something where some of these automatic responses habitual responses are quite fast and they need to sort of be overcome.
Yeah.
Do you think there might be some purchase in sort of, and maybe you've done this already, sort of forcing people to respond really quickly? So something like the response signal task where you give people a beep and they've got to basically press.
Yeah.
Or something like that to, you know, usually where accuracy doesn't budge, RT does show a lot of that. Is that something that?
Yeah, that's something that, so time pressure is definitely in this task. So they have like 600 milliseconds to make their decision about whether or not they're going to respond, because otherwise it's too late if they do want to respond. And there has been some work looking more at kind of instructed SR mappings under intense time pressure. So participants have to, there's like a beat 1, 2, 3, and then they see the stimulus and they have to try and follow the the beat to try and just do it as quickly as possible. Problem is that then you introduce a lot of errors, right? Like there's kind of a limit to how much extreme time pressure you can have. When to be goal directed, you have to think about the outcome and assess whether or not it's valuable on this trial and then make the response. So by completely just removing the ability to do that, I guess, yeah, are the errors driven by habit, or are they just yeah, everything's happening too fast and just having to, so I guess it's kind of, yeah. But certainly when people do instructed SR mapping, so there's no outcome evaluation, there's no outcome retrieval and then deciding whether or not to respond. It's just simply for these stimuli, you make these responses, they learn it over and over, and then they switch to them. So it's just all, you know, like the banana button thing. And there they've modelled the time course of habitual errors. And there does seem to be this very fast SR association, which can be quickly overridden. But the question is, like, to what degree is an instructed SR mapping, which is more like a kind of Stroop task, or to what degree is that the same as this SR association that emerges through goal-directed learning, right? So you're learning, everything you do in the beginning is you're learning about the association between stimuli and the responses you can make and the outcomes, and that's how you learn about consequences. And oh, when I flick the switch, the light comes on, and that's what I want to do right now. So that SR association of I flick, you know, I come in the room and I flick the switch, that has emerged because of you've learned about the properties of the world and the outcomes and the consequences. So I guess the kind of debate in the field is these are probably two different types of SR learning, one that's very instructed as opposed to one that's emerging during goal-directed learning. So yeah, I mean, who knows? You definitely go down a rabbit hole with that stuff. It's fascinating. Lots of people are looking at it.
Love a rabbit hole, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, it's really great. I just had a question about the behavioural task that you're using. I'm curious to know why, following the devaluation of the outcome, you paired that with a different stimulus from the training phase.
No, so that was probably me just like not doing, so yeah, it's always fixed. The stimuli, it will never change. The outcome associations with the stimuli. Sorry, I probably should have said that, and I probably might have mixed them up in amongst my slides. But no, once they've learnt the association between a stimulus and an outcome, that will never change. The only thing that will change is the value of the outcome, and that's what they have to base their decision to respond or not on. But no, we don't mix it up. It'll make it really hard. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
I have a question about in terms of, I suppose, goal conflict. So I guess it's something that you're getting at when you're adding in a working memory load. But I guess some of the striking examples in real life is, so there's times when motivation is low, but then in cases where motivation might be high, like with food or substance use, it could be because there's some kind of a goal conflict, because, you know, they have these goals about abstaining from it, but then there's also the fact that they like it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was wondering if there's any way to map that experimentally, where there's like goal conflict, to then see if habits then kind of shine a bit brighter in that context.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I guess the goal conflict is kind of what the proponents of these alternative models would argue, would say that, you know, we just need to worrying about there being this stimulus response association, that really it's just that the goals you might have a slip of a goal, right? So you thought you wanted to abstain, but actually it turns out you didn't. And so that's the kind of, the conflict is very much what's driving whether or not you're going to make the behavior or not, whichever goal is winning right now. So they would argue that you don't even, under that, you don't even really need there to be SR associations, because everything is driven by the goal, and there is that conflict, of course, and that sometimes this unhealthy goal is winning. That's what's driving the behavior. So then the approach is more like, okay, we need to address why is that goal so valuable, and that should be our kind of focus, rather than trying to worry about stimuli in the context that might be driving behaviors. So yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think goals, we can't get away from the Pavlovian idea that context can also trigger anticipation of different goals, and so that might well be more viable model for understanding how these very powerful outcome representations can trigger unwanted behaviours.
I have one more question. Just,
We're going to have lunch, right? So
yeah.
happy to keep answering questions during lunch.
So thinking about some of the motor results and thinking about some of the reaction time results, the implication seems to be that there's something going on maybe in the excitability of the system, that whether or not a response is observed, the strength of the underlying tendency might be different. And I'm wondering if there's other sorts of behavioural data that you or anyone else could or have brought to bear on this, like vigor sort of stuff, for instance, like if you measure the strength of the button press with which they choose something.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. I don't think anyone's actually done that, looked at the strength of the SR association through things like vigor or grip strength. Grip strength's used a lot in the Pavlovian sense, but it's like in Pavlovian instrumental transfer, you might see how a cue makes someone make the instrumental response harder or stronger. But I haven't ever really thought about it in terms of a straight SR, but yeah, why not? That'd be a very cool idea. Yeah, other ways of getting it. It's obviously a very nuanced and not very sensitive effect. But again, it comes down to, but how useful is it for explaining human behaviour if it is so nuanced?
If it always manifests just with different, that's a good point.
It's so hard to observe.
So we should maybe finish up there. So perhaps can stick around for lunch for a little while, and then I think there's a Q&A with students at 2:30. Is that happening here?
I think it's in here.
Okay.
Yeah, so happy to chat to anyone.
Otherwise, please join me in thanking for being here.
Thanks, everyone.